They called her the Princess of Chaos, the only person on Earth who could bring a billion-dollar mafia empire to its knees. She wasn't a rival boss or a government agent. She was a 10-year-old girl so volatile she had dismantled everyone sent to tame her. 7 elite nannies vanished in weeks. 3 world-class therapists left the estate in tears. Her own father, a man who commanded thousands and feared no one, looked at her and saw his only true defeat. But then, a 23-year-old waitress with an empty bank account and a worn-out psychology textbook walked into her world. And she did the one thing the most powerful men in the city were too afraid to do. She stood her ground, looked the untamable Sloane Quan in the eye, and simply said, "No." What happened next sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. This is a story of power, secrets, and a rule breaker who changed everything. I promise you, you've never heard anything like it. Welcome to the American Mafia.B. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you are watching from. You know that sound? The sharp, violent explosion of something expensive shattering into 1,000 pieces? That is how our story begins, with the crash of a $10,000 antique porcelain plate hitting the linoleum floor of a small cafe in downtown Chicago. You know that sound? The sharp, violent explosion of something priceless shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces? That is how our story begins, with the jarring crash of a $10,000 antique porcelain plate hitting the linoleum floor of a small, quiet cafe in downtown Chicago. Let me tell you about Juno Whitaker. She was 23 years old, working grueling double shifts at a place called the Morning Light Cafe, and calculating every single penny just to make sure her lights stayed on. But Juno wasn't just a waitress. At night, she was a student, obsessively burying her head in psychology textbooks, trying to understand the mechanics of the human mind. She wanted to know why people hurt, why they lash out, and how they eventually heal. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to meet someone who would test every single theory she had ever learned. The girl's name was Sloane Quan. She was 10 years old, the only daughter of Killian Quan, a billionaire and the head of the most feared syndicate in the country. Sloane had a reputation that spread through the city's elite circles like wildfire. They called her the untamable. But this afternoon, inside this humble cafe, the power dynamic was about to flip. While her father, a man who could order a hit with a whisper, sat nearby with his head lowered and shoulders slumped. Reduced to silent shame by his own daughter's rage, Juno Whitaker did the unthinkable. Amidst the gasps of the background customers and the wreckage of the porcelain, Juno didn't flinch. She stood upright, centered, and completely unafraid. As Sloane stood over the mess, her face twisted in a mask of defiance and control, Juno didn't reach for a broom. She reached for the girl's gaze. For the first time in 10 years, someone looked at the billionaire mafia boss's daughter not with fear, but with a quiet, piercing authority that said, "I see exactly what you are doing, and it isn't going to work on me." The sound was high-pitched and violent, a crystalline scream that cut through the low hum of the Morning Light Cafe like a gunshot. A $10,000 antique porcelain plate, a piece Killian Quan insisted on bringing to every meal because he trusted no one else's hygiene, now lay in a jagged, glittering heap of white and gold on the linoleum floor. The cafe went deathly silent. Customers froze with forks halfway to their mouths, their eyes darting from the wreckage to the girl standing over it. Sloane Quan didn't look like a child. She looked like a small, beautiful storm. Her chest heaved with a manic energy, her eyes burning with a defiance that dared anyone to breathe. She wanted the gasps. She wanted the apologies. She wanted to see another adult crumble under the weight of her father's terrifying shadow. Beside her, Killian Quan, a man whose name was whispered with dread in the city's darkest corners, didn't move. He sat with his head slightly bowed, his broad shoulders slumped in a posture of profound, weary defeat. The man who could command an army of shadows was powerless against the rage of a 10-year-old. Juno Whitaker felt the heat of the room rise, but she didn't flinch. She didn't rush over with a broom or stammer out an apology for the accident. Instead, she set her tray down with a slow, deliberate click and walked toward the center of the chaos. She didn't look at the billionaire, and she didn't look at the broken treasure. She looked directly into Sloane's eyes. "That was a very loud way to say you're bored," Juno said, her voice calm and level, lacking even a hint of the tremor everyone expected. Sloane's lip curled. "It's trash now. Just like this place. My father could buy this entire block and tear it down because you were too slow with my water. Apologize." The background figures held their breath, waiting for the waitress to beg for mercy. But Juno simply folded her arms. "I don't apologize for perfection, Sloane. The water was exactly the right temperature, and the service was exactly on time. You didn't break that plate because of the service. You broke it because you're terrified that if you aren't the loudest thing in the room, you might actually have to listen to yourself think." For the first time in her life, Sloane's expression faltered. The rage was still there, but beneath it, a flicker of genuine shock appeared. She looked at her father, expecting him to roar in her defense, but Killian was looking at Juno. For the first time in months, his eyes weren't filled with shame. They were filled with a sudden, sharp spark of curiosity. The rule breaker had arrived, and she wasn't leaving until the mess was cleaned up. The silence following Juno's defiance was heavier than the crash of the porcelain. Killian Kwan rose from his chair, a slow, predatory movement that usually made men drop to their knees and plead for their lives. But as he stood over the glittering shards of his daughter's rage, there was no violence in his eyes. Instead, there was an exhaustion so profound it seemed to age him a decade in seconds. He looked at Sloane, who was vibrating with unspent fury, and then he looked at Juno, who was already beginning to clear a nearby table, as if the heir to a criminal empire hadn't just threatened her entire existence. "Leave us," Killian commanded, his voice a low vibration that cleared the surrounding tables in an instant. The background figures scurried away, leaving the three of them in a hollowed-out pocket of the cafe. He turned his gaze fully onto Juno. "My daughter has been dismissed from every elite academy in the state," he began, his voice devoid of its usual steel. "I have hired experts with PhDs from Harvard and bodyguards from the Special Forces. She broke them all within a week. I can negotiate treaties between warring syndicates, and I can move markets with a single phone call. But when I look at her—" He paused, his gaze flickering to Sloane, who turned her head away in a sharp, painful gesture of rejection. "I am a ghost in my own home. I have all the power in the world, and yet I am utterly defeated." Juno stopped what she was doing. She didn't offer pity. She knew a man like Killian Kwan would find pity more insulting than a slap. "You're trying to buy her obedience, Mr. Kwan," Juno said simply. "But you can't buy a connection. She's not a business deal to be closed." Killian stepped closer, the smell of expensive cologne and old tobacco surrounding her. "You didn't flinch when she screamed. You didn't apologize when she broke a piece of history. You saw her." He reached into his coat and produced a checkbook, his hands steady despite the emotional wreckage of the moment. "I don't want a nanny. I don't want a guard. I want someone who isn't afraid of the dark inside that girl." With a few swift strokes, he tore a slip of paper from the book and laid it on the counter. The number was staggering, $350,000. It was more than Juno would make in 10 years of double shifts. "That is for 1 year," Killian said, his voice regaining a sliver of its authority. "Be with her. Don't tame her. Don't break her. Just stay." Juno looked at the check, then at the girl who was currently trying to burn a hole through the floor with her stare. The money was a ticket to her future, but the look in Killian's eyes told her the real price. She was being asked to step into a lion's den where the lion was a broken child, and the floor was covered in glass. "I don't work for the money, Mr. Kwan," Juno said, tucking the check into her apron. "I work for the truth. And the truth is, you're both starving." The elevator doors slid open with a hushed, expensive chime, revealing a world of marble, glass, and a silence so heavy it felt intentional. As Juno stepped into the Kwan penthouse, the first thing that hit her wasn't the opulence, but the temperature. It was frigid, a calculated chill that seemed designed to preserve something dead rather than house the living. She walked slowly through the sprawling foyer, her sneakers squeaking softly against the polished stone. To any other visitor, The space would be a testament to unimaginable wealth. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a predatory view of the Chicago skyline, and the furniture looked like it belonged behind velvet ropes in a museum. But to Juno's trained eye, the apartment was a psychological desert. She scanned the long, white hallways, searching for the clutter of life. There were no discarded shoes by the door, no half-finished books on the side tables, and, most tellingly, no photographs. The vast, eggshell-colored walls were adorned with abstract paintings, expensive splashes of cold blue and jagged black, but there wasn't a single image of a smiling child, a wedding day, or a family vacation. It was a home stripped of its history, a place where memories had been surgically removed and replaced with a high-gloss finish. "It's like living inside a diamond," Juno whispered to herself, her voice swallowed by the vastness of the room. Hard, bright, and impossible to breathe in. She realized then that Sloane wasn't just a problem child in a rich house. She was a survivor in an emotional vacuum. Everything in the penthouse was meant to be admired but never touched, respected but never loved. The lack of personal touches spoke volumes about Killian Kwan's grief and Sloane's isolation. In this museum of silence, every loud outburst or smashed plate from Sloane wasn't just a tantrum. It was a desperate attempt to leave a mark, a scream for color in a world that was perpetually, devastatingly white. Juno felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She wasn't just here to watch a child. She was here to conduct an excavation. Somewhere beneath this pristine, frozen surface, there was a family buried alive, and Juno knew that if she didn't find them soon, the cold would finish what the silence had started. She straightened her posture, tightened her grip on her bag, and walked deeper into the heart of the ice. Sloane was perched on the edge of a velvet chaise lounge that probably cost more than Juno's college tuition, her small face twisted into a mask of practiced disdain. She didn't look up from her tablet as Juno entered the room. Instead, she let out a sharp, mocking sniff. "What is that smell?" Sloane asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Oh, I see. It's rubber and desperation." She finally looked up, her gaze traveling slowly down Juno's frame until it landed on her feet. "Those shoes, Juno. They're hideous. Are they from a thrift store, or did you find them in a dumpster behind the cafe?" Juno looked down at her scuffed, black work sneakers. They were worn at the heels and stained with the ghost of 1,000 spilled lattes, but they were sturdy. She didn't tuck them behind her other foot or flush with the shame Sloane was fishing for. Instead, she walked over and sat in the chair directly opposite the girl, invading her space with a calm that Sloane clearly found agitating. "They're called investment pieces, Sloane," Juno said evenly. Sloane let out a jagged laugh. "Investment? Those wouldn't even pass for rags in this house. My shoes are handmade in Italy. One pair of my boots could buy 100 of whatever. Those are." "You're right," Juno replied, her voice soft but unyielding. "Your shoes are expensive, but they're fragile. You can't run in them without scuffing the leather, and you can't walk a mile in them without getting blisters. You see, the things in this house are built to be looked at. They have price tags, but they don't have value." Sloane narrowed her eyes, the tablet sliding off her lap. "Everything has a price. Price is what you pay, but value is what you get," Juno countered, leaning forward. "These shoes have seen me through 12-hour shifts when my legs felt like lead. They've carried me to class when I was too tired to stand. They've lasted because they were built for the long haul, not for a photo op. Most of the things you own, Sloane, are designed to break or be replaced the moment a newer version comes out. I prefer things, and people, who are built to endure. Your father thinks he bought my time, but what he actually bought was someone who doesn't break when things get uncomfortable. Can your Italian leather do that?" For a second, the Princess of Chaos was silent. The jab at her father's wealth usually worked on the nannies, who would scramble to defend their own dignity or buy her new gifts to win her over. But Juno sat there, centered and proud of her scuffs. The language of cruelty had met the language of resilience, and for the first time, Sloane looked like she was struggling to find a translation. The penthouse was a vacuum of sound until the third night. Juno was sitting in her room, The spine of her psychology textbook cracked open when a faint, melancholic vibration began to hum through the floorboards. It was delicate, almost ghostly, a sequence of notes so hauntingly beautiful they seemed to weep. This wasn't the aggressive, chaotic noise Sloane made during the day. This was something private, a secret being whispered in the dark. Juno rose and followed the melody, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She moved past the museum hallways and the abstract paintings until she reached a heavy, double-paneled door at the very end of the west wing, a room she had been told was off-limits for maintenance. The lock didn't click when she pushed. The door was already slightly ajar, as if it had been forced open by someone small and desperate. Inside, the moonlight spilled across a grand piano, its black lacquer gleaming like a dark mirror. And there was Sloane. Gone was the princess of chaos, who smashed plates and mocked cheap shoes. In her place was a 10-year-old girl who looked impossibly small against the massive instrument. Her eyes were closed, her face stripped of its mask of defiance, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability. Her fingers danced across the keys with a precision that spoke of years of practice hidden under a cloak of rebellion. Juno recognized the piece immediately. It was a complex, soulful nocturne that Killian had mentioned was his late wife's favorite. This was the forbidden music, the sound of a mother who had been erased from the walls but clearly lived on in her daughter's hands. Sloane wasn't just playing. She was communicating with a ghost. Every chord was a bridge back to a time before the silence, before the cold penthouse, and before her father had started looking at her with shame instead of love. Suddenly, Sloane hit a sharp, discordant note and pulled her hands back as if the keys had burned her. She sensed the presence in the doorway and spun around, the mask of rage slamming back into place instantly. "Who told you to come here?" she hissed, her voice trembling. "Get out. This room is dead. My father said it's dead." But Juno didn't move. She stood in the doorway, her expression filled with a quiet, devastating understanding. "The room isn't dead, Sloane," Juno said softly, her voice carrying across the dark space. "It's the only room in this entire house that's actually breathing. And you aren't breaking the rules by playing. You're the only one keeping her alive." The defiance in Sloane's eyes flickered, the ghost in the piano still echoing in the air between them. For the first time, the girl didn't have a cruel retort. She just stared at Juno, her breath hitching in the silence of the forbidden room. The fragile piece of the music room was shattered the following morning, not by a breaking plate, but by the sharp, rhythmic click of designer heels against the marble foyer. Victoria Kwan didn't enter a room. She conquered it. As Killian's younger sister and the self-appointed guardian of the family's public image, she moved with a predatory elegance that made the vast penthouse feel even smaller. Juno was in the kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast for Sloane, when Victoria appeared in the doorway. She was draped in silk that shimmered like oil on water, her eyes scanning Juno with the clinical detachment one might use to inspect a stain on a rug. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she let out a short, airy laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "So, this is the miracle worker," Victoria said, her voice a polished blade. The little waitress Killian picked up from the gutter to play house with his daughter. Juno wiped her hands on her apron and met Victoria's gaze. "I'm Juno Whitaker, and I'm not playing house. I'm doing the job 7 of your qualified recruits couldn't finish." Victoria stepped into the kitchen, the scent of her expensive, suffocating perfume filling the air. She leaned against the counter, her movements precise. "Let's be clear about what you are, Juno. You're a stray dog. My brother has a soft spot for charity cases lately because he's drowning in his own guilt, but I don't share his sentimentality. You've managed to survive a few days because you're a novelty to Sloane, a new toy to break. But don't mistake luck for talent." She leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "You are significantly out of your league. This is a family of dynasties and secrets, not a psychology case study for your night school homework. You think you're helping her, but you're just a temporary distraction before the inevitable. I have spent years positioning myself to ensure the Kwan legacy remains intact, and I won't have it compromised by a girl who smells like cheap coffee and ambition." Victoria reached into her Hermes bag and pulled out a slim, gold-embossed card, flicking it onto the counter. That's the number for a private car service. Use it today, and I'll make sure the rest of your salary is paid out as a severance. Stay, and I will make it my personal mission to ensure you leave this house with nothing, no reputation, no degree, and a criminal record that will follow you back to that cafe. Juno looked at the card, then back at the woman who saw human beings as obstacles to be cleared. You're afraid, Juno said softly, a small smile playing on her lips. You're afraid that if I actually fix what's broken in this house, you'll lose your chance to control it. Victoria's mask of composure slipped for a fraction of a second, her jaw tightening. Consider this your only warning, stray. The world of the Kwans doesn't just reject people like you. It crushes them. The manufactured family dinner was an exercise in psychological warfare. Victoria had insisted on a formal setting, filling the long, mahogany table with heavy silver and tension. She sat at the head, orchestrating a conversation designed to make Sloane look like a ticking time bomb. Every few minutes, Victoria would lob a subtle, barbed comment, criticizing Sloane's posture, her silence, or her unfortunate habit of interrupting adults, waiting for the girl to explode. Under the table, Sloane's foot was tapping a frantic, erratic rhythm against the floor. Her face was flushed, her small hands gripping her napkin so hard her knuckles were white. She was seconds away from screaming, from throwing her crystal water glass and proving her aunt right. Juno, seated beside her, caught the girl's eye. She didn't whisper or reach for her hand. Instead, she leaned in slightly and spoke in a voice so calm it acted like an anchor. Remember the smart move, Sloane, Juno murmured. She wants the noise. She needs the chaos. If you give it to her, she wins the round. But if you give her the opposite of what she expects, you take her power away. Sloane took a jagged breath, her eyes darting to Victoria, who was currently telling a charming story to Killian about Sloane's most recent failure in tutoring. What do I do? Sloane hissed under her breath. You agree with her, Juno whispered. With a smile. Precision, not rage. Victoria paused her story, leaning forward with a predatory glint in her eyes. Don't you agree, Sloane? Your temper really is becoming a liability for your father's reputation. Perhaps a boarding school in Switzerland is the only way to save face. The table went silent. Killian looked up, his expression a mix of exhaustion and dread, waiting for the inevitable outburst. But it didn't come. Sloane let out a soft, melodic laugh, the kind she had practiced in the music room. She set her fork down with a gentle click and looked her aunt directly in the eye. You're absolutely right, Aunt Victoria, Sloane said, her voice steady and eerily polite. I have been quite a handful. I suppose I was just frustrated because I didn't have the right guidance. But now that Juno is here, I'm learning so much about self-control. It must be a relief for you to see me finally improving, isn't it? The effect was instantaneous. Victoria's smug smile curdled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She had been robbed of her ammunition. Killian's head snapped up, his gaze moving from his daughter to Juno with a look of stunned realization. For the first time, Sloane hadn't been the victim of the conversation. She had been the director. As Victoria gripped her wine glass, her poise finally fracturing, Juno caught Sloane's gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The Princess of Chaos had just learned her first lesson in strategy. In a house full of monsters, the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous. The atmosphere in the penthouse shifted from a cold museum to a high-security crime scene in less than an hour. The occasion was the Diamond Gala, a high-stakes fundraiser meant to cement the Kwan family's philanthropic standing. Victoria had arrived early, dripping in family heirlooms, but by mid-evening, a scream echoed from her dressing room. The Harrington diamond, a necklace worth over $1 million and the centerpiece of the family trust, was gone. Killian's security team, men with hard faces and earpieces, locked down every exit. The gala was paused, and the guests were held in the ballroom, but Victoria had a different target in mind. She marched into the kitchen where Juno was helping the catering staff, her face a mask of calculated grief and righteous fury. "I warned you, Killian," Victoria cried out as her brother approached, his expression darkened by the chaos. "I told you that bringing a stray into this house would end in disaster." My mother's necklace didn't just walk away. Juno stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her face remained a shield of granite. "I haven't been near your room, Victoria. I've been in the kitchen or with Sloane all evening." "Is that so?" Victoria sneered. She turned to one of the security guards. Search her. Search her jacket on the coat rack. I saw her hovering near the West Wing earlier." The guard looked to Killian, who gave a slow, pained nod. Juno watched, a sinking feeling of dread pooling in her stomach, as the guard reached into the pocket of her worn denim jacket, the one she wore to and from her night classes. He didn't find $1 million necklace. Instead, he pulled out a small, crumpled slip of yellow paper. "It's a pawn ticket," the guard announced, handing it to Killian. Killian's eyes scanned the paper, his jaw tightening. The ticket was dated that morning, describing a high-value diamond piece, and listed for a staggering amount of cash. It was the ultimate betrayal. To Killian, it looked like Juno had used her proximity to his daughter to scout the house and strip its history for a quick payout. "I've never seen that in my life," Juno said, her voice dropping an octave. She looked at Victoria, who was watching with a glint of triumph so sharp it was almost visible. "That's not mine." "The ticket has your name on it, Juno," Killian said, his voice sounding hollow, as if the light she had brought into the house had just been snuffed out. "I gave you a chance. I gave you my trust. And you used my daughter to get close to the vault." Victoria stepped forward, her voice a poisonous whisper. "I told you she was out of her league. Call the police. I want her in handcuffs before the guests leave." Juno looked around the room, realizing the trap had been perfectly laid. In the world of the elite, her word was worth nothing against a piece of paper and a billionaire's accusation. For the first time since entering the penthouse, the rule breaker was the one who looked broken. The handcuffs were already out, the metal glinting under the harsh gallery lights, when a small, sharp voice sliced through the room. "Don't bother," Sloane said. She was standing in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the dark hallway, holding her tablet like a weapon. Victoria didn't even look back. "Sloane, darling, go to your room. This is adult business. Your little waitress turned out to be exactly what I said, a thief." But Sloane didn't move. She walked into the center of the circle, her eyes fixed not on the police, but on her father. "You always tell me that in our world, information is the only currency that matters, Dad," she said, her voice eerily calm. "You think I'm just a problem you need to hide. But while everyone was busy ignoring me, I was busy watching everyone else." With a flick of her thumb, she mirrored her tablet screen to the massive digital display in the ballroom, usually reserved for charity tallies. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainier, wide-angle view of the coat rack in the West Wing. The timestamp was from earlier that afternoon. The room went silent as the video showed a woman in a shimmering silk dress. Victoria, glancing nervously around before slipping a yellow slip of paper into the pocket of a denim jacket. "I have cameras hidden in every room of this house," Sloane said, her gaze finally shifting to her aunt, whose face had gone from triumphant to a ghostly, sickly white. "I call it my private cloud. I started it because I wanted to see which nannies were stealing my jewelry. But today, I caught a much bigger rat." The video continued, showing Victoria moving to the wall safe, entering a code she thought no one knew, and pocketing the Harrington diamond. The evidence was undeniable. This stray dog hadn't betrayed the family, the blood relative had. Killian Kwan looked at the screen, then at his sister, his expression shifting from heartbreak to a cold, terrifying clarity. The air in the room seemed to freeze. He didn't scream. He didn't need to. He simply turned to the security guards and made a slight gesture toward Victoria. "Take her out," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "And make sure she never sets foot in this city again." As Victoria was led away, screaming about her birthright and her legacy, Killian turned to Juno. The apology was written in his eyes, but Juno's attention was on Sloane. The girl who had been labeled dangerous and broken was standing tall, her chin up, finally using her brilliance for something other than destruction. She had saved the only person who had ever truly seen her. "The smart move," Sloane whispered, echoing Juno's words from the dinner table. Juno let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a lifetime. "The smartest," she replied. 6 months later, the cold, museum-like silence of the Quan penthouse had been replaced by something far more vibrant. The air no longer felt thin or artificial. It felt lived in. Juno Whittaker walked through the foyer, her sneakers quiet on the marble, but she didn't feel like an intruder anymore. She was wearing a professional blazer over her favorite sturdy jeans, carrying a leather portfolio embossed with the name of the newly formed Solhi Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing music therapy and psychological support for at-risk youth, named in honor of Sloane's mother. Juno was no longer counting pennies to keep her lights on. As the director of the foundation, she spent her days ensuring that children who were labeled difficult or broken were given the same thing she had given Sloane, the dignity of being truly seen. She had finished her degree, but her real education had happened within these walls, proving that the rules of power were nothing compared to the rules of human connection. As she approached the West Wing, a familiar melody began to drift through the hallway. It wasn't the lonely, ghostly tune she had heard on that first rainy night. It was fuller, richer, and noticeably imperfect. Juno stopped at the door of the music room and leaned against the frame, a soft smile tugging at her lips. Sloane was at the grand piano, her fingers flying across the keys with the effortless grace she had once kept hidden. But she wasn't alone on the bench. Beside her sat Killian. The man who once ruled a shadow empire with an iron fist was now focused intently on the sheet music, his large, scarred hands picking out a clumsy, hesitant bass line. He missed a note, creating a jarring discord that would have made the old Sloane scream in frustration. Instead, the 10-year-old simply rolled her eyes and nudged him with her shoulder. "You're flat again, Dad." From the top. "Try to keep up with me this time." Killian chuckled, a deep, genuine sound that Juno hadn't known he was capable of, and reset his hands. "I'm trying, Sloane. Some of us didn't inherit your mother's natural timing." They started again, the sophisticated melody and the simple bass line weaving together into a new kind of harmony. It was messy, it was a work in progress, and it was the most beautiful thing Juno had ever heard. They were no longer a billionaire and his greatest failure. They were a father and a daughter finding a common language. "You're late for the board meeting, Juno," Sloane called out without breaking her rhythm, her eyes bright with a mischief that was no longer cruel. "I know," Juno replied, watching them. "But I think the foundation can wait 5 minutes for a masterpiece." In a world built on status and fear, Juno Whittaker had broken every rule to prove a single truth, that no one is truly untamable when someone finally dares to look them in the eye and stay. She had walked into the lion's den as a waitress and walked out as the architect of a family's redemption. And as the music filled the room, Juno knew that the Princess of Chaos had finally found her peace.